I'm Suzzane Robotti, and as the founder of MedShadow, what we are is a health news website. We're a nonprofit. We are independent. We don't accept pharmaceutical money or medical device manufacturing dollars. We focus on the side effects of medicines. We don't work on medical devices because it's a big world. So we do both OTC and prescription drugs, and that is our unique point. My awareness of the risks of the side effects of medicines came because I'm a DES daughter. DES is diethylstilbestrol. It was a drug given to women, pregnant women, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, until 1971. It was given to the women, telling them that it would prevent miscarriage. It did not. It was a bad drug with bad research, and sadly, life happens. In 1971, there was a clear causal relationship drawn between DES and the offspring who were showing up at the ages of 17 to 30, showing up with very serious cervical and vaginal cancers called CCA. It's a unique cancer. If you get that cancer, it means that you had DES. It's a marker. So we got lucky, or the world got lucky. A DES mother said, "Hey, my daughter I was given DES," and the mother staying next to her, whose daughter had CCA, said, "My daughter, I had DES," and that's the only way they found it because it's still so rare. Importantly, that was 20 years on average after they were born. The drug had been out since the mid-1940s, and nobody had even seen it, put it together at that point. Once they realized that there were other issues that DES caused. It's a synthetic estrogen. I'm getting too far into the details here, but it caused fertility organ abnormalities in many of the offspring, male and female. Females are much more researched. The males, while they had significant abnormalities, they were minor compared to the women, pretty significant to the men. But women have T-shaped uteruses, tilted uteruses, very, very high infertility rates. So as a DES daughter, I was lucky I did not get the cancer, but I am infertile and knew that since I was 14. What else? So DES Action started. So this is my background. So I started MedShadow. DES Action was an advocacy group started about 40 years ago, a little over 40 years ago, to educate and identify and advocate on behalf of those exposed for DES. I became involved with it 6 or 7 years ago. I was a member forever, but DES Action chose to move under the umbrella of MedShadow, so I'm now the executive director of DES Action also. About 2.5 years ago, I was also appointed as a consumer representative on the FDA's Drug Safety and Risk Management Advisory Committee. So the FDA advisory committees are there. I think there's like 50 of them in total. Cover any new drug or device that the FDA would approve before it goes to the marketplace. The Drug Safety and Risk Management Committee is one that normally meets in conjunction with other committees because we're an adjunct when there is a particular issue of safety involved with it. So we've been doing a lot on opioids lately, and people wanting that. So I'm here today to talk to you about a legal case. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a doctor. I'm just a consumer representative, self-educated. And if I make misrepresentations on medical or legal facts, it would be inadvertent, and please correct me, but I think I've got this all straight. I work very hard to get it straight. So this legal case riveted my attention because a pharmaceutical company came up with several pharmaceutical companies came up with a very simple idea on how to circumvent the FDA's ability to have them add to the drug label significant adverse events. And so I'm here to kind of step you through on how it happened. The drug is Fosamax. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about what's on the back side of this paper. About post-approval drug label changes. So when a medicine is newly approved by the FDA, part of the negotiation is what information will go on the drug label. And what would be left off? There you go. And it's not that hard to figure out when a drug is brand new because we don't know much about it. It's only been tested on maybe a few thousand people at best. It's gone through a lot of studies. They're very good studies. It does prove safety and efficacy, as Lindsay was talking about before. But still, it hasn't gone out to very many people. So a rare side effect that happens 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 people would not usually be identified. So in the negotiation of what goes onto a drug information label, drug label, would be obviously most drugs have nausea, diarrhea, headaches, all the minor stuff. But when it comes to the anticipated severe adverse events, the real problems, there's a balance between you don't want to scare people so much that they won't take a good drug because it happens once every 100,000 people. But people have the right to know what the risks are for the drugs that they're taking. And so it's a very tricky tightrope that is walked. There is also the issue of legal protection. If an adverse event or a side effect is listed on the label, then you really have a tough time suing the drug company for any harm it might give you. So drug manufacturers are motivated to put it on the label for your education, but they don't want to put it on the label because you won't buy the drug. So it's tricky. Very interesting point. At some point after the FDA has approved a drug, almost every label gets changed because they'll find out about new side effects. A study was done reviewing all the drugs approved between the years 2005 and 2010. They found that 25% of them were required within 5 years post-marketing. Within 5 years, they found out enough about it that they had to add a black box warning or a very significant side effect warning. I should stop here and say, I use the word side effect and adverse event almost interchangeably, and that's wrong. They're different things medically. It's kind of a slight difference from a consumer's point of view. I talk to consumers, I talk to people. If anyone has a better word than consumers, please tell me. It's so awkward to say consumers, but people. But I talk to people for whom the words adverse events is not immediately clear. It's not intuitive. Side effect, everyone knows what a side effect is. So if somebody dies from the side effect of a drug, they get that. It's really an adverse event. So it's a little liberty I take. Okay, so keep this in mind when you're taking a drug yourself. If you have the option of taking an older drug or the brand new drug, don't take the brand new drug. Within 5 years, you're going to find out a lot more about it, and only use it if you failed on everything else. Just keep yourself safe. Keep your family safe. So because of that, the FDA has a process on how to update a drug label after it's been approved. There are 2 processes that they can use. It's called changes being affected, meaning that the drug manufacturer just changes the label and says, here's a significant problem, you need to know about it, so that doctors know about it and the patients know about it. These drug labels inform doctors and nurses as well as they do patients. Importantly, they do it ahead of time, and the FDA would then review it afterwards and comment, potentially having them remove it or change it. Alternatively, and what most drug manufacturers do, is they have a prior approval supplement, PAS, request for a label change. Then once they've filed that request, they're required to wait for the FDA to comment on the label change. The FDA can either approve it, or they would send a complete response letter telling them it needs to change or it's denied for whatever reason. If the label doesn't get changed and the FDA has refused it, then the FDA has effectively indemnified the pharmaceutical manufacturer from any lawsuit. So it's often a happy day to a pharmaceutical company when their drug label gets denied, the drug label change gets denied. just to review, osteoporosis is one of those diseases that women dread, and there's a lot of women in the audience, so you know this. There's breast cancer, and then there's osteoporosis. I mean, it's one of the, we should worry more about heart attacks probably, but it's up there. It's a debilitating disease. 10 million people have it each year. 8 million of them are women. A woman's risk of breaking a hip is equal to a combined risk of breast, uterine, and ovarian cancer. I thought that was a really odd but interesting way to look at it. 1 over 2 women over the age of 50 will break a bone because of osteoporosis. And about half the people who have a hip fracture will not regain their ability to live independently. It's a problem. Let's talk about Fosamax because this is interesting to me. In 1995, Fosamax was approved for osteoporosis in postmenopausal women. At the time, there was I should say, it's an alendronic acid, and it's a bisphosphonate derivative, just to be official. At the time, there was some indication already that it could cause atypical femoral fractures. That's not what they were called, but it might cause spontaneous fractures. Merck indicated that to the FDA. The FDA did not see a direct correlation to that. There was not really enough information to put that on the label. So they did not require it to be on the label, and they weren't. So Fosamax works by slowing resorption, which is the breakdown phase of the natural bone remodeling. There's casting off, casting on. You guys have medical degrees. You don't need me to explain osteoporosis to you in detail, I hope, because I can't. But by using Fosamax, it ultimately increases bone density, bone and mineral density. And it does significantly reduce the risk of spine, hip, and wrist fractures in women with osteoporosis. It's a good drug, and it was a new drug, and there really wasn't anything else out there for osteoporosis. So, we're all very happy to have it. Come on, slide. There you go. In 1997, Merck went back to the FDA and requested approval to an indication to use Fosamax for the prevention of osteoporosis, to use it with osteopenia. This is important. It was approved. This is important because it meant people would be using the drug for a much longer period of time. And that turned out to be crucial. Between 1999 and 2005, Merck began receiving reports of odd fractures that were going on with women who were taking Fosamax. Particularly people who were taking it for long term. And it was significantly different than a stress fracture. A stress fracture is an incomplete fracture of a long bone, the vast majority of which never progress to a full and complete fracture, and is generally prescribed or treated by prescribing rest and inactivity for the affected bone. A Fosamax fracture is very different. They were called atypical femoral fractures by the court, and described as a rare type of complete low-energy fracture that affects the thigh bone. So there's an X-ray of it. Fosamax fractures are frightening, life-altering events. They mostly happen to older women who have less of an ability to heal quickly and well and recuperate. They happen with no warning. A woman might be taking just a step or standing up from a sitting position, and the leg will simply collapse out from underneath her. It's a complete fracture. It often ruptures the skin and almost always requires an operation. Subsequent studies have noted that the fractures often happen 5 to 7 years after a woman's been taking Fosamax. So that's why it's important to understand when women start taking prophylactically, they could be taking it for 30 years. But after 5 to 7 years, you start to have a problem. The NIH's National Institute of Arthritis, Musculoskeletal, and Skin Diseases studied the time period between 1996, when Fosamax was being given into the general population of older women, and 2007. And they concluded, and forgive me for my pronunciation of medical terms, In the context of declining typical hip fractures among the U.S. elderly, we observed small but significant increases in the incidence of subtrochanteric fragility fractures. We estimated that for every 100 or so reduction in typical femoral neck or intertrochanteric fractures, there was an increase of 1 subtrochanteric fragility fracture. In other words, 100 women, for every 100 women saved from a stress fracture by using Fosamax, 1 woman suffered a life-altering Fosamax fracture. And a bit redundantly, the consequences of a hip fracture, 1 year, 20% would die 1 year after a hip fracture. 30% have a permanent disability. 40% are unable to walk independently ever again. And 80% are unable to carry out at least one independent activity of daily living. In 2006, a Merck employee in Singapore reported that she had learned of 8 cases of atypical femoral fractures suffered by long-term users of Fosamax. She suggested that those events might be a signal for a label update. In 2005, Merck received a report from an orthopedic surgeon about reporting on 25 patients who had taken Fosamax for a long time and suffered long bone fractures with features consistent with atypical femoral fractures, noting in the hospital they're the ones who coined the term Fosamax fractures. Simultaneously, Merck was also receiving adverse event reports on necrosis of the jaw. This is a painful condition where the jawbones become exposed. In 2013, Merck agreed to pay $27.7 million to settle 1,100 lawsuits from individuals who alleged that Fosamax caused them to develop this condition. I'm not going to go further into this condition because I'm really focusing on Fosamax fractures, but this is even much more rare than a Fosamax fracture, and yet it's more than 1,100 women that went all the way through a lawsuit for it. In June 2008, the FDA was also receiving reports through their FAERS program. FAERS is the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. And they sent Merck a request for information about these atypical femoral fractures. Merck never once denied that the atypical femoral fractures were being caused by long-term Fosamax use. Let me just interrupt this program to talk about the FAERS reporting system. It's terrible. It's just terrible. Nobody uses it. A fraction of the people use it. Some gentleman pointed out on the MAUD system, you know, that the 7,000 people who reported whatever is a tiny fraction of the people harmed, and that's absolutely true with the FAERS system for drugs over-the-counter and prescription. But worse than that, first of all, nobody uses it. It's cumbersome to use. But worse than that, when you do put reports in it, they are discounted substantially. On my work on the FDA committee for DSARM, Drug Safety and Risk Management, I was just in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, and we were asked to review opioid prescribing guidelines for children, pediatric. It's like, well, no would be the answer, but you know, sometimes it's necessary and you have to do that. So the pharmaceutical company requesting the guidelines from the FDA, and the FDA went through the FAERS system and pulled out 100 adverse events reported on pediatric use of opioids, so that they could get an idea what it's really just a signaling device of what people are finding out or how they're being harmed. Of those, and I can give you these, if anybody wants these real numbers, this is a rounding number. It was like 104 or something, but it was about 100 reports they pulled out. And I can give you the exact numbers when I get home if you want them, so call me. Of the 104, they threw out 66 of them, leaving only 33 that they would consider when setting up guidelines for pediatric opioid prescribing. The 66 they threw out because while every one of them had filled out the 3 forms that it has a little asterisk that says this is required, Other information such as confounding events, other drugs they're on, why they were taking it, what hospital they took it at, what doctor prescribed it. One or more of those lines were missing, so they could throw it out and not consider it. So in this committee meeting, I raised my hand and said, that's 66 reports, and we're talking about guidelines to cover the entire industry. Couldn't you have hired somebody to call up 66 people? You know, one of the required lines is, how do we contact you? And ask them for the missing information. And they said, no, that's no one's job to do. So please, please, please report to fairs, but take the time and do it all. Do it all. I know it's a pain in the neck, but otherwise, the FDA has no idea what's going on. Not no idea, but it's their signaling device. So when the FDA came to Merck and said, you need to change the label, or we need to know what's going on with these atypical femoral fractures, and everyone agreed that there needed to be a label change. They had two choices, changes being affected or prior approval supplement. The Merck decided to send in a prior approval supplement, and they suggested language, and I quote, low energy femoral shaft fracture. The FDA sent back a complete response letter, which is a refusal, saying they could not approve it as it was stated in its present form. The FDA said specifically, your justification for the proposed precautions section language is inadequate. Identification of stress fractures may not be clearly related to the atypical subtrochanteric fractures that have been described. The FDA, Merck, took that as a free pass. They called the FDA. There were a few more conversations recorded. A low-level Merck person recorded a conversation with a low-level FDA person where the FDA person said, no, the FDA is not going to allow a label change to show the fractures at all. And they took that conversation and that complete response letter and said, we have no ability to change the label, we're not going to change the label. So a year later, when that became clear, the FDA convened their own panel of experts, one of the committees that I was talking about before, and as a result of their own investigation, announced that it would require bisphosphonate labeling to include a warning describing the risk of atypical fractures of the thigh. On the same day, the FDA directed Merck specifically to add 3 worded paragraphs describing atypical femur fractures in the warning and precautions section. Again, Merck resisted. Merck proposed revised language that added 5 references to stress fractures, including the language relating to risk factors for stress fractures that Merck had proposed and the FDA had already rejected in 2008. It's now 2010. The FDA rejected each of Merck's proposed references to stress fractures and required a warning about atypical femoral fractures, explaining that the term stress fracture was considered and was not accepted because for most practitioners, the term stress fracture represents a minor fracture, and this would contradict the seriousness of the atypical femoral fractures associated with bisphosphonate use. Merck is not the only one who used this tactic in the past, but I'll get back to that. So, more than 500 women, each of whom had suffered a Fosamax fracture during the time period that the label was being debated, entered class action lawsuits. Each state had their own set of lawsuits, and there were so many involved that the courts rolled it up, consolidated them into one suit that's called Albrecht et al., Albrecht being the lead suit, and directed it to be heard before the district court in New Jersey. Albrecht argued that Merck's proposed warning described was insufficient, misleading, and failed to depict the seriousness of atypical femoral fractures. But further, the lawyers argued that it was Merck's responsibility to return to the FDA with the correct label changes so the FDA could approve it. Merck could not just walk away from its responsibility. Other drug companies had done this and gotten away with it, by the way. Merck's defense relied on the legal doctrine of the impossibility preemption. It means that Merck claimed it was impossible for them to comply with both laws. They couldn't comply with the FDA's ruling that they could not change their label, and they couldn't warn people. So they couldn't be sued. Right, the state law requires adequate label warning of the atypical fractures, and the FDA would not allow it. So when a conflict like this happens, a federal law prevails over state law, and therefore there's no state remedy. Women could not sue Merck for this problem that they've known about for 10 years. Merck also pointed to the email exchange that I described just before, that a low-level FDA employee said, we're not going to let you change the wording. So it goes through the District Court in New Jersey. New Jersey agreed with Merck and dismissed the complaint. It got bumped up to the Third Circuit Court, who vacated that decision, saying Merck had not clearly met the standard for the impossibility defense, and a jury would have to examine the factual basis for impossibility. And this is kind of goofy. The court says specifically the jury would have to decide if the FDA would have approved a label change if presented with the one that reflected fractures more accurately. So Merck argued that against that, and now we're at the Supreme Court. So we actually were at the Supreme Court. My organization, MedShadow, sponsored an amicus brief along with 3 former FDA officials. An amicus brief, a friend of the court filing, are filed by individuals or organizations that are not a party to the case. We're basically a health journalism site. We're not even a strong advocacy site. We just want to give people the education, the information they need to make intelligent, informed decisions about their own health care. We think that that is a patient's right, and we think it's a doctor's responsibility to make sure they get it. But we got involved with this because if Merck can circumvent its ability or its responsibility to tell people about something like Fosamax fractures, then gosh darn it, that's just not right. So we stepped in. We felt it was a distortion of the impossibility preemption. Okay, and now I'll talk faster. And that Merck was just disingenuous in everything that it did. A true warning was never offered, and true warning was never rejected. It also would cause a terrible precedent. If a drug manufacturer could conceivably never properly warn doctors and patients about significant adverse event risk by offering the FDA a weak label change. So the Supreme Court, it actually ended up being kind of good news. The decision was good news for patients and doctors' rights to information. Essentially, the court kicked the case back down to a lower court to have a judge determine the ridiculous statement, what the FDA might have done if Merck had offered the label change that the FDA requested. But much more importantly is what the court said getting to that conclusion. Regarding the basis for the FDA rejection, the court stated that the FDA's rejection was based at least on part on Merck's description of the side effect as a stress fracture, which the FDA did not believe properly notified the public of both the severity and atypicality of this type of fracture. During the arguments, Justice Gorsuch pointed out that allowing the process Merck used could create incentives for companies to submit weakly supported label changes to the agency, knowing that when those label changes are rejected, the companies will be free of further liability. So he totally got it. Yay. Regarding the impossibility defense, Justice Breyer also announced the court's meaning of clear evidence of the FDA denial to be evidence that shows the court that the drug manufacturer fully informed the FDA of the justifications of the warning required by state law, and that the FDA, in turn, informed the drug manufacturer that the FDA would not approve a change to the drug's label to include that warning. So what it meant was that something like a conversation or a single letter would not fulfill the requirements for impossibility clause. So this is much, much more support for patients' and doctors' rights to get information on this. And the central premise, according to the court's opinion, is that manufacturers bear the legal liability for such harms and for the content of their labels warning the public of those possible harms. This responsibility translates to a duty to to adequately warn when the risks of a particular drug become apparent. So it places all the responsibility back on Merck, back on the manufacturer, where it belongs, and not with the FDA, who has no ability to cover 11,000 drugs that are in the marketplace, doesn't have the access to information that the drug manufacturers have. So I think I just talked my way all the way through that. I do want to say one thing. This I thought was an interesting slide. Risks with and without bisphosphonate therapy, hip fractures. You know, the number of cases annually in blue when treated, number of cases annually when not treated in red. Obviously, it does a lot of good, but there is a new study that came out just a couple of weeks ago. There's a meta-analysis, and it was in JAMA, Internal Medicine in August. Meta-analysis found osteoporosis treatments did not reduce overall mortality, but it did reduce fractures. One would expect it to reduce overall mortality. So that was interesting and a signal that there's more to come with Fosamax. Thanks. How'd I do?